All right, I'm going to jump right into things tonight because so much is going on. And I want to start in a place sort of sideways of where people have asked me to start. And that is a question about the Epstein files. And what people are asking about, first of all, and a lot of, is the testimony from Sasha Riley, and why are people not talking more about that? And the answer to that is that sort of a big life lesson here. The radical right is salting a lot of crap around the Epstein files. It's doing that really quite deliberately, because then if some of the material turns out to be fake, they will be able to discredit all of it. So people are taking any new material like that really, really carefully. And I would urge you to remember that if it is proven true, whenever that gets chased down, or if it is not, the horrors that the Epstein situation has visited on its victims, the survivors, and also on the country, are not going to be less bad because they're coming out a little bit later. So that's, I've gotten emails all day with people talking about that and asking me to write about it, and I will not do so until it has been thoroughly vetted and looks really clean. And there's a lot of material in in and around the Epstein files that has not turned out to be accurate. So I wanted to start there with that question because so many of you asked it, but I don't want to stop with the Epstein files, because everything else I'm going to talk about is always in front of the backdrop of the fact that the administration is breaking the law even as we speak. That is, on November 19th, the U.S. Congress overwhelmingly passed a law requiring, not saying we think it would be ducky if you felt like, requiring the Department of Justice to release all the Epstein files, not the ones they felt like, by no later than December 19th. And I know math is not my strong suit, but December 19th went flying by many weeks ago. Within that law, it's called the Epstein Files Transparency Act, and you can Google it. Unlike many of the laws that Congress passes, it's actually quite short and very understandable. It's only about a page long, small type, yeah, but it's very clear. In addition to requiring that those files be released, there were very specific guidelines for what could be redacted, and it was to protect the victims and nothing else. And we know that the Department of Justice has said, but there's another law that says we have to make sure that nobody's reputations get hurt. And that's why we have blacked out so much of it. What they have released at this point is estimated to be less than 1% of the totality of those files. And they are now saying, well, there's just so much we can't get to it. In addition to the release that was required, the Department of Justice was also supposed to explain and justify every redaction. Well, of course, that went by the wayside as well, in part because they haven't released anything, or they've released less than 1%. So keep that in mind, because clearly there is something in those files that they know is going to be unbelievably damning. And the way you know that is not just the obvious, that they're not releasing them, despite the fact that Attorney General Pam Bondi said last July she had gone through them all, but also because think of what the administration has done to the 5, I believe it was, members of Congress, maybe 6, who released that video reminding U.S. military personnel that they had a duty not to obey illegal orders. They've gone ballistic over that. We now know that Jason Crow of Colorado is being investigated. We know that Alyssa Slotkin is being investigated. And they've tried to go after Mark Kelly of Arizona, Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona, to reduce his retirement rank, sort of going after him administratively because of that video. In that video, they simply reiterated the law. These are lawmakers reiterating the law. And they also have the protection of what's known as the speech and debate clause, which is outlined in the Constitution. And it is designed to make sure that Congress critters can criticize the government openly and can say things about the government without any kind of legal or professional repercussions or personal repercussions. Now, it's the speech and debate clause that the radical right has been using to seed crap all through the news all the time, because you can't go after something a congressperson says. So, they say crap in investigations, and then it makes the news, and nobody can say, hey, you shouldn't have done that, because they're covered by the speech and debate clause. So these same Congress people who said you can't, you have a duty not to obey an illegal order, are now, that's what the administration is going after them for saying, despite both the First Amendment and the speech and debate clause. But why am I bringing it up in the context of the Epstein files? Why did the administration go so bonkers over that? Well, now we know that, in fact, on September 2nd, that first set of strikes had at least two things that legal analysts have called war crimes. And the entire operation itself looks as if it is also illegal and part of breaks all kinds of international rules. And those war crimes are, first of all, that they used a plane that appears to have been decorated, made to look like a civilian plane, which is against the rules of war, and also that double tap that killed the people who were in the flotsam is also a war crime. So why did they go so ballistic and try to shut those people up? Because it looks like they had already broken the law. And that's what I think you're seeing with these Epstein files. They know they're in deep trouble, so they're trying to muddy the waters. And they're muddying the waters not just by refusing to hand over these files and saying, oh, there's just so much, but also by trying to pull the Clintons into this. And so far, lots of people are saying, oh, yeah, the Clintons should testify. Let me break that down for you a little bit. There were, I believe it was 8 subpoenas related to the Epstein files that the House Oversight Committee put forward. And then they dismissed 6 of them. They have only interviewed 2 people in the last year. And now they are trying to hold the Clintons in contempt, even though Bill Clinton has been out front saying, please release everything that has my name or my photograph in it, because you're just trying to make this about me when it's really about Donald Trump. And of course, Hillary Clinton wants no part of this, because this has been a real way that the Republicans have repeatedly turned out their voters, is by accusing her of things. They'll lock her up, the email things, the Benghazi, all of that stuff. And I just think she's done. She's not going to play that game any longer. But this is not about the Clintons. If it is, if they're in it, more power to whomever takes them to court and arrests them and all that. But this is, again, an attempt to make those Epstein files go away. And the more they do that, the more it says to me what we've already seen is horrific. So it says to me that there is something really bad in the Epstein files. And please don't lose track of that. All right. So now the other thing I want you to keep your mind around as we move forward through the material today is Trump is not okay. I got a number of emails today with people saying to me, what's he going to do next? You've said things are going to get bad. What's it going to be? Have you ever had a relative who's got dementia? And again, I'm not a doctor. I can't diagnose this man, but I can listen to him. And I know he is completely erratic, does not seem to know what's going on. I can't tell you what he's going to do. But it's worth remembering in all of this that this is a person who is acting entirely by impulse, whatever looks good at the moment. And then his handlers and the Republicans in Congress are trying to make sense of it on the other side. And so you're seeing stuff that just doesn't make any sense at all. You're also seeing people putting pressure on him in different ways because they just don't know what he's going to do. And they're trying to stop him from doing things like attacking Iran or attacking Greenland. And so that's another thing, is I'm trying to make some sense out of this for you. Recognize that we have never in our history had a president who was mentally, many forks shy of a picnic. And that's what we got going on here. So those 2 things are really important in the background. But there's also another thing. I'm sorry, boy, when I went into American history, I did not think I was ever going to be, literally, the material that I'm going to talk about tonight would be an entire administration in any other presidency. And we're doing it all in this one day. And it's every day like this. There's a reason you're exhausted. And partly that's by design to make us exhausted. Anyway, the other thing to remember here is that Trump is badly underwater in every poll. And he's badly underwater even in what are his signature issues. So the economy, for example, lots of people voted for Trump because they wanted the economy to get better after the pandemic. And in fact, he has really thrown a spanner into the works of the economy. Inflation, we know from material that came out in the last day or so, inflation continues higher than it should be. It's about 2.7. Usually the Fed likes it around 2. It's higher than it was under Biden in the last several months of his administration when he was bringing inflation down. It's going back up again. And we also have the problem that real wages have not kept up with it. Under the Biden administration, real wages actually increased faster than inflation. That is no longer happening. And hiring is also down significantly. So the economy is a hurting thing. But also we have the issue of immigration and ICE's enforcement of the immigration rules. Now, there's a bunch of things that are causing problems right now for the administration. One of them is that a new report today out from Wired, which is a really interesting magazine, by the way, as is 404 Media, both organizations that look primarily at technology. Anyway, Wired today came out with a study about the ways in which the U.S. intelligence community has been looking at Tren de Aragua, which is the Venezuelan gang that Trump insists has invaded the United States. And what they found was that looking through hundreds of pages of reports from U.S. intelligence in 2025, that in fact, U.S. intelligence is not even sure that gang is operating in the U.S. While there are members of that or former members of that gang operating in the U.S. and committing low-level crime, they are not at all sure that in fact there is any kind of an organized attempt to make Tren de Aragua a thing in the United States. So that whole justification for this really violent crackdown, remember the Black Hawk helicopter where the people rappelled into an apartment building in Chicago, now looks at, and said we had to because this place is full of Tren de Aragua. Well, maybe not, so they have that hanging out there now. But the real thing hanging over the administration is that the American people did not like the roundups of undocumented immigrants and sometimes legal immigrants and sometimes U.S. citizens anyway. They thought that this was way more than they bargained for when Trump ran for office in 2024. He said he was going to go after the worst of the worst. Remember, the criminals, the rapists, the murderers, and so on. Instead, what we're seeing is what one always sees, as I've said before, when you have roundups like this, officials always go after the low-hanging fruit. They always go after the women and the children, the vulnerable populations, because they're easy. And this is written in neon all over American indigenous history whenever the officials went after a group of indigenous Americans that were hostile, usually young warriors. They didn't go after the young warriors. They went after the elderly and the women and the children because they didn't fight back. Well, you're seeing the same thing now with these sweeps, and Americans didn't like it. And they didn't like it before a week ago Wednesday. But a week ago Wednesday, when the ICE agent Jonathan Ross shot and killed Renee Good in Minneapolis, a 37-year-old white mother, real support, any kind of real support for ICE deployments just plummeted. It just fell off a cliff to the point right now that only about 20 to 30% of Americans think that ICE is doing a good job and everybody else doesn't. Those are really bad numbers. I have said to you before that even in the worst of a worst case scenario, a right-wing movement will have between 20 and 30% approval. Even at the very end, even when it's going down, you really never go below 20%. And in this case, they're at that with this, with the ICE deployments. So they have that going on. At the same time, on December 23rd, I believe it was, the Supreme Court said that the administration could not federalize National Guard troops to impose its will in Democratic-dominated cities. That they didn't. It wasn't a final decision. It was a temporary decision. But usually, that's a pretty good indication of where the court is going. So now all of a sudden, you've got a president who can't use the federalized National Guard the way that he and the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, have been arguing. You may remember in October, Stephen Miller talked about Trump having plenary power over the military, including the National Guard. And the Supreme Court just said, not so much. The Supreme Court said that you can't, in fact, the president cannot, in fact, use the National Guard instead of the military to enforce laws. And the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 prevents the government from using the military that way. So it looks as if the administration is trying to ratchet up violence in order to give it an excuse to invoke the Insurrection Act. And this, by the way, is something that Stephen Miller has called for a long time. And their seeming understanding is that the Insurrection Act will let them declare martial law. Those actually aren't the same thing. The Insurrection Act would let the military enforce federal law and any state laws that involve constitutional rights. It's not clear that they would be able to enforce state law. Of course, the Trump administration has been interpreting federal law really, really broadly. So I'm not trying to downplay what this means. I'm suggesting this is really a stretch. But it seems clear that's what they're trying to do. And I'm going to come back to what Governor Tim Walz is doing to try and prevent that. But before I get there, I want to point out something. And that's that when Trump was using the concept of federalizing the National Guard troops and being able to move them state to state, he took on Los Angeles, he took on Portland, Oregon, he took on Chicago. When he took on those big cities, those are big cities, he wasn't very successful. So the next place he really has deployed stuff is on the cities that are the next size down, the next tier down in terms of size. Minneapolis, St. Paul, beautiful cities, by the way, but they're not as big as LA. And the reason I mention this is because there's all kind of rumors out there today and statements out there today that the next thing he's going to do is he's going to go into Lewiston, Maine. Lewiston, Maine has a fairly large Somali population. They've been there a long time. I mean, I don't know anything about citizenship rates here. I know in Minneapolis, the citizenship rates of Somali Americans is about 95%. And I'd be very surprised if it isn't the same here. As I say, this is not a new population of Somalis. But the reason I mention that is, have you been to Lewiston, Maine? I've been to Lewiston, Maine quite a lot, actually. And it's small. It's teeny tiny. So why do I mention that? Because I think there's a numbers problem here for the Trump administration. That is, right now we know there are about 2,000 ICE agents. We also know that Trump has been pulling in Border Patrol agents, and it appears there's been at least one sighting of a different kind of police force, and now I don't remember which one it is. Remember that the Department of Homeland Security has a lot of different kinds of law enforcement within it. And so to some degree does the Department of Justice. The Federal Bureau of Investigation sits under the Department of Justice, and it certainly has agents who are supposed to be doing sort of white-collar crime, corruption, and so on, that they have removed and put onto immigration enforcement. But there's just not a lot of people there yet. They're trying to hire a lot of people, but as you know, that's not going brilliantly either. They've had to get rid of age caps because they're not coming up with as many people as they need. The reason I mention this is because as you are looking at your television screen and you're seeing these truly horrific pieces out of Minneapolis, I'm going to talk more about them in a second. Remember that there are more than 340 million people in this country. And if you watch what the administration is doing, it's having to move these ICE agents around. And again, the minute you decide that you've got to take over Lewiston, Maine, as a show of force, clearly there's an attempt to terrorize the people not just, by the way, the Somali Americans, but also white Americans. I mean, at this point, it's pretty clear they're trying to terrorize white Americans as well as immigrants. I'm not saying that this won't be horrific if they do it, but come on. I mean, if you could go into New York City or Lewiston, Maine in order to enforce your will, what does that say to you, right? So I wanted to have that piece there, but I also want to back up a little bit. Tim Walz, governor of Minneapolis, has been begging people in Minneapolis not to give the administration an excuse. And I'm seeing a lot of people saying, why doesn't he call it the National Guard? Why doesn't he get in there with them? Well, remember that governors are responsible for the people in their states. And in my experience, which is not nothing at this point, they care deeply about the people in their states. I don't spend a lot of time with radical right governors, but certainly even the moderate Republican governors that have come across my path, and certainly the Democratic governors, they care deeply about the people in their states. I mean, deeply, literally. I mean, I guess it's okay if I say this because he's not in office any longer. But my only contact at that point, I did later campaign for him, with Sherrod Brown, was I had once referred in one of these nightly letters I write to the Rust Belt, which is what historians have called Ohio as being in the Rust Belt. And I woke up the next morning to a text on my phone. I have no idea how I got my number, saying, please don't refer to my state as part of the Rust Belt. We are the Opportunity Belt, and my people. And it was just this whole thing. And I thought, man, this is a guy who cares a lot about the people in his state. If he went to the trouble of finding out where I was and saying, please don't do this again. And do you know what? I never did do it again. That was pretty typical of the governors. They care a lot about the people in their states. It's a reason they're governors, And Tim Walz, if he calls out the National Guard in Minnesota, the feds are going to be violent toward them. People are going to get hurt. And he doesn't want to do that. I mean, I assume, I don't have any contact with him at all, but he doesn't want to put Minnesotans in that position, because if things start to happen, people from Minnesota are going to get hurt. So when people are all over him going, why are you being such a wimp? I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think he's actually sort of saying, I'm trying to keep the people that I protect from getting hurt. And I think you're going to see that a lot from the governors. There are a lot of places where state governors have backed off if their people looked like they were getting hurt. And to some degree, Trump is trying to weaponize that by saying, okay, I'm going to come after you, and you're going to back down because otherwise I'll hurt your state. And that actually has been a piece of leverage that has worked pretty well on occasion. So I think that's what is happening in Minnesota. But the other piece of that, of course, is that the images that we are seeing coming out of Minnesota look a great deal like the images from the civil rights movement. I mean, literally last night, yet another person got shot, apparently in the leg. And I'm not going to try and tell you what happened there, because the only information that has come out has come from the administration, and I just don't trust it anymore. They have a very formulaic thing they say, and I'm not there for it. And I could not find a police report of what had happened. And at the same time as that happened, we do have a report of the fact that a family with 6 children got caught in what appeared to be some kind of a clash between protesters and the police after that shooting. And 3 of their children, they were in a van, they were just trying to get home. 3 of their children got hit with tear gas, and a flashbang grenade detonated near their van, and all the airbags went off, and the kids got hurt. So 3 of the kids got taken by ambulance to a hospital for treatment from tear gas and from the flashbangs. And there was no problem in Minneapolis until ICE got there, and that's worth remembering here, that this is being caused by the feds. And we also have this image of a young man from California, I believe it was, who got hit in the eye socket and has lost his eye in California during the ICE raids there. So these images that we're seeing are infuriating a lot of people who were not otherwise involved. I keep saying about all the people who are not involved. The reality is it's becoming increasingly clear to white Americans that these raids are not just about undocumented criminals, as Trump initially said. They're about American civil rights, and they're about American constitutional rights, and about the attempt of the administration to take them away from us. And as we do that, as we become aware of that, that 340 million person weight begins to get traction against this very small group of federal agents. So if that's what's in the background there so far, you have a president who is under extraordinary stress. Extraordinary stress. Not only does he have the Epstein files out there, not only has he gone underwater on immigration and on the economy and on this big immigration issue, but also he keeps lashing out to try and show how powerful he is. And as he lashes out, he gets extreme pushback. So this idea that we are going to attack Denmark or take over Denmark has organized Europe to stand against the United States of America. And the idea that we want to go into Greenland is enormously unpopular with the American people, but it is also unpopular with significant percentages of the Republicans in Congress who have no real interest in destroying NATO and destroying the rules-based international order that, among other things, protects world trade. I've talked about that before. Vladimir Putin likes it quite a lot, but there are a lot of Americans who look at this and say, what are you doing? Like, we already are an ally of Greenland. You want to put more troops in Greenland? Greenland will say, here, let us help. This idea that somehow we need to take it over to get those things is just crap. And Trump actually said in an interview the other day, I want to own it. As I say, he's mentally breaking down. I want to own it. This is important to me psychologically. I want to own it. Well, it's not important to me psychologically, and it's not important to another 340 million Americans psychologically either. So the more he tries to do these things, the more pushback he is getting. At the same time, I think you are seeing some of the stress points coming out here. One of them is the fact that the administration raided the home of Hannah Nathanson, a Washington Post reporter, yesterday, allegedly to try and find her files on people who were leaking to her. This is a really big deal to have gone after a member of the press, and she's a very, very good reporter. I quote from her often. And clearly what they're trying to do is to intimidate reporters, but also to find out who is leaking from the administration. If you're that worried about leaks, you know you've got a problem in the administration. One of the things that you never saw from the Biden administration was leaks. They didn't feel the need to go behind the back in that case. Very rarely. There were a few leaks over the Palestinian crisis and Gaza. But for the most part, you just didn't see that. When you see an administration leaking like a sieve and complaining about it, you know you got a problem. Remember the plumbers? The Richard Nixon's plumbers? It's always a way to think about it. Where they were called the plumbers is because they wanted to prevent leaks. And when you want to prevent leaks, you get plumbers. And the reason that Nixon thought he needed someone to stop the leaks was because of the Pentagon Papers. And in the Pentagon Papers, which, by the way, ended before he was in office, they only went up to a certain point, and didn't go into his administration, but he was afraid that they would go into his administration. And we now know that he pulled some really dirty shenanigans even before he was in office in scuttling peace talks with Vietnam before, under the Johnson administration. And my guess has always been that he knew that was going to come out. And if he was afraid people knew about that, and if that came out, he'd end up in jail. Or in prison. And that's always been my guess with that. Anyway, I just traced back leaks, plumbers, and there's an administration that's like, we can't have leaks. Clearly, Trump is very worried that somebody might leak something. Well, what do you think that could be, by the way? All right, so you see it with that attack on Hannah Nathanson, which is a really big deal to go after a press person. But you can also see it in a couple other things. That I think are really important to throw into here. You may or may not have seen it yesterday in all the crap that's flying, but the U.S. said yesterday that it has sold $500 million worth of Venezuelan oil. Now, you may have not put these two things together, but you also might remember that Trump said, by virtue of the fact that he is commander-in-chief, and that somehow, I mean, I'm not even going to try and chase this down because it doesn't make logical sense, but because the military took Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores, that and the next administration under his Maduro's former vice president, that apparently has given Trump access to oil. Sorry, I'm struggling with the logic here. That Trump is the one who has control over that money from the sale of the oil. Okay, so Trump says he has control of the money. And at that point, when he said that, instantly, oil companies that had their property seized after the 2007, not the 1976, but the 2007 nationalization of the oil fields in Venezuela, said, excellent. If you're going to be selling oil from Venezuela, they owe us. I think ConocoPhillips is owed $12 billion, or some huge sum. They basically said, okay, excellent. If you're going to take that money and you're going to sell that, if you're going to take that oil and sell that, here's our handout. We have outstanding claims against the Venezuelan government for our property that got stolen, or got taken. So hand over the Benjamins. Trump then, on Friday, I think it was, issued an executive order saying that we have an emergency. This is, I believe, his 10th emergency declaration that enables him to go around the law and says, you can, I don't care if you lost money and that you actually have claims against the Venezuelan government. I'm not going to pay any attention to that. I get control over that money. All right. So yesterday, they apparently sold $500 million worth of Venezuelan oil. Where did they put that money, do you think? In the Treasury? The U.S. bank? No, it's in a bank in Qatar. And Trump, theoretically, according to him, is the only person who has control over it. Now, many things could be going on with that. I promise you that's not okay on any level. And if a Democrat did it, he'd have been impeached by now. But the reason that I put that in the category of there appears to be concern is it is like boilerplate that when a person in charge of a country is worried about their future, they start to stash money that the government can't get its hands on. This is dictatorship 101. So the fact that the U.S. president has a bank account in Qatar with a certain, up to $500 million. I mean, maybe they put it in a bunch of different places that only he can control theoretically. These are all his statements. Whether the law is going to agree with it is something very different. That says to me, this is not a man who's confident that he's going to stay where he is now. But finally, I want to leave you with something else that happened that takes us right back to the beginning of where we were when I said you cannot forget those Epstein files. And that's that on Tuesday, Trump was doing a tour of a Ford plant, sort of to shore up his base among the workers, right? That's theoretically the people who back him, and that's what he likes to think. And somebody yelled out at him something. It has been reported he yelled pedophile protector. I think at least Trump heard pedophile. I'm not sure he heard protector. And by the way, I read my letters every day for a podcast for people who don't want to read them. So I'm getting, it's been 2 solid years now. So I'm getting pretty good at voice work. And I think if you go and say to yourself, pedophile protector, and listen to it, you will hear that pedophile comes out quite loudly. Protector is harder to hear. So I would make the case that at the very least, Trump heard pedophile. He may or may not have heard protector. But when this guy yelled pedophile protector at him, rather than blowing it off, and by the way, politicians get heckled all the time. This is like it's just like literally when I do an interview with a politician, in public, we always have a plan for hecklers, just because there's always a heckler, right? So this is not, and you don't get it's just the way it is. Like, this is just a thing. When this guy said that, Trump didn't ignore him. He gave him the middle finger. Like, that's a really big deal for a president to crack like that. He gave him the middle finger, but he wasn't done. He actually dropped the F-bomb twice. F you, F you. In this factory, with workers all over the floor looking up at him, that's what he did. And I'm telling you, the only time I can think of that we have had a president crack like that was when, I'm so sorry, but when Andrew Johnson was doing his swing around the circle in 1866, before the midterm elections of 1866, which he insisted were on which the future of the country was going to hang. At that point, he cracked during one of those, and he compared himself to Jesus Christ, and he started arguing back and forth with hecklers, and he really never recovered from that moment. It's something historians talk about as like even his supporters were like, oh, dude, this was a bad idea. So when you think about this moment, we are in it up to our eyeballs. And I'm going to tell you again, it's going to get worse. This is going to get worse before it gets better. But for all the horrors, and they are horrors, it is not clear that the administration is in fact going to be able to pull off what at this point is very clearly an attempt to overturn our democracy and create a fascist government. It just isn't. So again, what can you do going forward? And I'm going to be a weenie here, like I said to my friend Joanne on last Saturday. I've actually been trying to get enough sleep, which, as you know, is a little bit odd for me. It really makes a difference to get enough sleep and eat right. That sounds stupid, and I feel like I feel like this is freshman in college 101. But I'm 63 and I was not getting enough sleep, and I probably won't tonight. But try to take care of yourself and to take care of the people around you. Because we're all on edge. People are snapping. They're mean to each other. I've noticed I'm short-tempered. Try and give people grace and to do something nice for people if you possibly can. It'll make them feel good, but I promise you it'll also make you feel good. And once you get past that personal stuff, call. Both at the local level, these local elections we've got going on in this next year are incredibly important. Run for office, work for people, create teams of people to get voters out, work at the local level, work at the state level, work at the national level, but keep your voices heard. And I want to say a final word here. I'm seeing a huge amount of frustration with the Democrats and how many of them don't seem to be stepping up to the plate. Some are not. I just want to reiterate that we are not in a normal period. You do not have to wait for your party or your people to start speaking out. You can push them to speak out. And if they don't, you can find someone who does, or you can start speaking out yourself. So this, the more you voice what you care about and the future you want to see, the more likely you'll find other people like that, and the more likely the pendulum will move in that direction. A friend of mine was embarrassed today. He said he called Susan Collins. I live in Maine, for those of you who don't know. And he called Susan Collins, who's the Republican senator. And his wife said, I'm just embarrassed, because he started screaming at the person, saying, what are you thinking, that your president is coming into Lewiston? And this is not how he normally behaves. And I said, you know what? They needed to hear it. At this point, our electeds need to hear what we care about. So make sure you speak up. And the more of us who speak up, and the more of us who continue to own the space of this country that, after all, belongs to us, the better the chances are that we can restore American democracy. And on the other side of that, as I keep saying, we don't know what things are going to look like. But we do know that if we can push back against this administration and reclaim our democracy, we have the opportunity to rebuild the country in a better way than it was before January of 2025. And, it hadn't been working real well for about 40 years. So now we get the chance to do it again right. And the comparison, as I say, of Selma and Birmingham and so on to these shots out of Minneapolis is a really useful one, not only because it helps us to remember just how horrific progress in the past had to be. I mean, it had to be before we got progress, but also because we remember that on the heels of those horrific moments that cost so many lives and so many families and so much opportunity for people, those 4 little girls who were killed in church and so on. On the other side of that, we got to build a better country. And we still have that opportunity to do it even better now. But I got to tell you, here's what my contribution is going to be to that. I have ideas about stuff I'd like and so on. And I hope I get to talk about tax policy. But what I'm going to contribute to that is I'm going to be the person in the back of the room always saying, okay, these changes are great. How are we going to make sure we never backslide again? Because that's going to be a key lesson going forward. Let's start right in with something that you didn't ask me to talk about, but that's really been on my mind, and that I want to make sure that we put first of all, a line in the sand, and then second of all, an explanation. The line in the sand is a reminder that it is not normal to have a political leader, certainly the President of the United States, currently under 4 separate cases of indictments around the country for different alleged crimes. And it's a little disconcerting to me, the degree to which people are talking about this as if it is normal, and the degree to which people in the right wing are talking about it as if, well, now we're going to go after Biden. Biden has done nothing that is impeachable, even. So there's a lot going on, but I just want to make sure, first of all, that we don't lose sight of the fact we're in a really, really unusual place. First of all. Now, the second thing that you didn't ask about that I really care about a lot is this. So I was reading CNN the other day, and there was an article there that talked about all the things that Hunter Biden had done wrong. And Hunter Biden is President Joe Biden's 53-year-old son. And I was reading it and I was thinking, what's going on here? Because I've read all these transcripts and this is not what happened. And I remember thinking sort of, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe if this reporter thought that that's really what's going on, maybe I better go back and reread it. Maybe I'm just wrong on this. Then I took a closer look, and it was not a reporter. It was an op-ed, and it was an op-ed from somebody on the right. But unless you knew the places that the nature of the places that this person had worked, you would not necessarily know that he was not talking honestly. And I actually went out kayaking, and I thought, if I just got hoodwinked a bit, and I'm pretty good at this stuff at this point, how does anybody know? How do you know? Maybe I'm the one wrong. And how do you know whether or not somebody is telling you the truth or not? Because it's not a crime to lie, as the Jack Smith's indictment of former President Trump points out. We have a First Amendment right to say whatever we want. And it's, you can get out and say that. So how do you know who's telling the truth and who's not? And maybe some of the people you trust are actually not telling the truth. As in, when I looked at that article and thought, what's going on here? And the answer to that is the courts. The reason that what is happening right now is so important is because of the place in the United States where you can tell the difference between what somebody is just saying in front of the TV cameras and what really happened is the courts. Because in a court of law or in front of Congress, it's also a crime to lie to Congress when you're testifying, or in a court of law, there are legal penalties for lying. So, one of the things that is really jumping out right now to me is that the rise of the lawsuits against people in former President Donald Trump's orbit, and those who are not, is the degree to which those who are Trumpers or who are on the far right are saying really crazy stuff, and it's everywhere, but they won't say it in a court of law. And so I'm going to outline a few of those things for you because I think they're really important. So I started with the example of that CNN story and Hunter Biden, and I will come back to that. But one of the big things, of course, that happened yesterday, and I will talk about that. Unfortunately, it's only one of the big things that happened yesterday, but was the fact that former President Trump and 18 co-defendants were charged in Georgia by the district attorney for Fulton County with a number of counts, of criminal counts, 41 total, I think, but those numbers are not in front of me. And as I say, I got very little sleep last night, so all times and temperatures are approximate as always here. For their attempt to overturn the 2020 presidential election. And I can tell you more about what that looked like. The indictment was essentially broken down into 4 pieces of crimes associated with that attempt. And many people on the right are now pulling out a single line and saying, oh, you're criminalizing talking at this point. But that's not actually how the kind of charges that Fani Willis brought operate. That is, they were indicted in part under the Georgia racketeering influenced RICO. I'm sorry, I'm too tired to grab it. The RICO statute, which is an anti-racketeering statute in Georgia. There's a federal one too, but there's one in Georgia that is pretty comprehensive, more comprehensive than the federal one. And because of that, all the pieces of that racketeering charge add up to a larger whole. So don't believe it when you see there's one line saying, oh, they're criminalizing talking now. That's actually not at all what was going on. But one other little piece there about the charges is that under the Georgia RICO statute, not the federal RICO statute, but the Georgia RICO statute, you're not allowed to lie. You're not allowed to lie about anything to do with an election. And that is, according to the charges, what the former president and 18 of his co-conspirators did, or the 18 named co-conspirators. There were also identified 30 unindicted co-conspirators. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But so with that, the a special grand jury in Georgia. In a special grand jury, somebody asked me about this. The difference between a special grand jury and a grand jury is that a grand jury sits for a limited, in Georgia, is that a grand jury sits for a limited amount of time and it handles a lot of different cases. A special grand jury is what Georgia convenes in order to look at a sprawling case, because you don't want to try and do everything in a month. It's going to take a long time. You put together a special grand jury, but what a special grand jury does is it investigates. So in this case, it investigated what had happened in Georgia after the 2020 presidential election and the attempts to overturn the results of that election in Georgia. And because the RICO statute in Georgia lets you do this, apparently, in other states as well. They looked at that, and they also heard testimony, I believe it was from 75 witnesses, and that's going to come back in just a minute. And they're able to say, oh, wow, this is what we found. But they don't have the ability to issue indictments. So what they did is they made a report, and they made the report back in January. Do you remember that woman who was on TV and sort of sounded kind of loopy, and everybody was like, what's going on here? That was that special grand jury. Then another grand jury can read the report and hear the prosecutor's version of what they think should happen, and they're the ones who vote on whether or not to indict. So it's a two-step process, largely because of the difference in time required by a sprawling case that needs a special grand jury. Really important that in both of those cases, those are ordinary citizens. That's not Fani Willis. That's not the Democrats. That's not any of the things that you're hearing from the radical right. That is people just like you and me who sit there and listen and decide what they think they're seeing. All right. So anyway, The reason that I wanted to start today with the CNN story and with how we know is because the special grand jury and then the grand jury in Georgia and now the Fulton County DA's office has said they think that crimes have been committed. And they think that crimes have been committed because they have heard testimony under oath and they've actually seen the documents. Now, we haven't, and maybe they're wrong, but their considered opinion under those circumstances is that a crime has been committed. Now, one of the first things that happened after that came down just before midnight last night was, first of all, that Rudy Giuliani, who had an illustrious career at one point in his life, but Rudy Giuliani, who is up to his eyeballs with the attempt to overturn the 2020 presidential election, came out with a statement in which he said, this is all false, and this is, once again, the Democrats trying, you know the language, I don't remember what it was, but I've stopped writing about that stuff because to me it's just a cookie cutter at this point. This is all, evil people who are trying to get me, and this is the destruction of our our legal system. And you keep hearing this a lot, but that's really important because Rudy Giuliani has been saying that stuff now since during the Trump administration, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But he says it in front of the TV cameras. When he is in front of the law and when witnesses are in front of the law, he changes his tune pretty dramatically. So at the end of last month, he went in front of a court and admitted that he had lied about Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman, the two election workers that he said were stuffing ballot boxes. He admitted that. He said, I'm not contesting that I made false statements about them. What he wants to go on and contest is that it hurt them. And that's a different case that we're not going to go into. But when actually in front of a court, he's got nothing to stand on. And you will see that when he talked after the election about what he considered voter fraud, he made it look like his witnesses were in a courtroom. They set it up to look like a courtroom, but they were not under oath. And that really, really matters. So again, after Giuliani said that last night, when he himself in front of a court of law had said, yeah, I lied about this. Now he's out there because there's no cost. He can go on Truth Social or Twitter or wherever he was and say, or I'm sorry, X or whatever he was and say, that's a lie. I mean, I could go there and say whatever I wanted because we don't have rules against that, or the ones we have are very, very cumbersome in this country. But he won't say it where there's a penalty in front of a court of law. So why did I give you this whole setup? Because one of the first things that Trump did, maybe you can't hear me because I'm exhausted. Hold on, I'm going to turn my volume up, see if that helps. One of the first things that Trump did is that he now is out on social media saying that he's going to show us a report proving this is all lies. He's had plenty of opportunities to make that case in court, and he lost all but one of them, and that one was procedural. It was not substantive. And he could make that case in court, for sure. That's what our court system is for. But he's not going to court. He's going to social media. And that is a very different thing. You can't believe that any longer. There's no reason to believe Rudy Giuliani or Donald Trump or any of the people on the radical right who make these statements, because they can say anything they want, and apparently they do. So as we go forward into this, it's really important to remember that a lot of this stuff is just noise. Not to bother to listen to Rudy Giuliani saying, well, I know somebody. If he did, he could say it in a court of law. And if he's not going to say it in a court of law, there is no reason to believe him because they are lying. So that's how you tell the difference in this moment between what is really happening and what is not. Are people willing to say it in a court of law? And that brings me back to that initial piece I mentioned about Hunter Biden. So this case, the Hunter Biden case, is really interesting to me right now because you've heard all the crap out there about how Hunter Biden and Joe Biden took bribes of $5 million, and the Biden crime family is another thing you're hearing on the right, took all kinds of money from foreign entities, and on and on and on and on. But when they are in a court of law, or when their people are under oath, their witnesses are under oath, they will not repeat those statements. So one of the big things that came out last week, or maybe slightly before that, was the fact that Devon Archer, who was Hunter Biden's business partner, and theoretically the man who had all the evidence against Joe Biden, the stuff he was saying in front of the cameras, the stuff that the Republicans were amplifying and exaggerating on social media. But you can read that transcript. It is online. And by the way, the Republicans didn't bother to show, only 2 Republicans, I think it was, very few Republicans showed up for that hearing, and they didn't stay the whole time. They clearly didn't want to know what he actually said. They were using him to get this story going. The person who did stay the whole time was Dan Goldman, who is a Democrat, and he came out and he said, this is BS. I was there, you weren't, this is what happened. And under pressure from him, they did release the transcript, but they did it when there was huge Trump news, so not a lot of people saw it. But when Archer testified, he said, I never saw Joe Biden do anything untoward with business. He did, in fact, talk to Hunter Biden's business associates because he called his son once a day because Beau Biden was dying right then. And he called to check in. And if Hunter Biden was at dinner, at a business dinner, he would put it on speakerphone and say hi to my friends. And Biden would say, hey, Joe, how are you? That was it. You know, that the pieces that were there added up really differently under oath than they have been extracted by the radical right. And that really matters, because if you step back one more step from the Hunter Biden story, what we are getting today essentially is the radical right, the Trump right in the Republican Party, doing the work that Trump and Giuliani tried to get Volodymyr Zelensky to do before the 2020 election, in which they wanted to smear Hunter Biden and thereby bring down Joe Biden. And now, because Zelensky seems to be a little bit busy right now, and that was a snarky way of saying there's no way he was going to get involved now, certainly in the past, they came right up to the edge of him actually giving a statement saying that Hunter Biden was under investigation. He wasn't, and Burisma was not at that point. Burisma was a corrupt company in the past. They brought on Hunter Biden because his brand was honesty and not illegality and staying within legal lines. So instead of trying to work with a foreign entity, they are literally now working with Republicans in Congress, which is mind-boggling to me. But they're developing this idea that, again, I saw on CNN, that Biden is corrupt, that you don't need to look at Donald Trump as anything special because every politician is corrupt, especially Joe Biden. Joe Biden's strongest suit is his character, or one of his strongest suits is his character. They're going to tear that down before the 2024 election. And again, one of the things about this is sometimes people tell me I'm a shill for Biden. And you know I was not a Biden supporter, but I'm trying to look at this like a historian and see what really is happening. And this is kind of setting my hair on fire, because the flooding of the zone with disinformation has gotten to a point where, for example, Chuck Todd this weekend on whatever his show is said, well, you know, the way Joe Biden has handled the Hunter Biden case, Joe Biden has very deliberately not interfered with a Trump-appointed with a Trump-appointed investigator and now special counsel in the Hunter Biden investigation. That's a Trump-appointed man. David Weiss is Trump-appointed. He will not comment on it. He has not stepped into it. He's been entirely hands-off. He has had nothing to do with it. But Chuck Todd now on this national program said, oh, well, the way he's handled this is causing a real problem. That flooding of the zone does something that was pioneered in Russia called virtual politics. And it's actually intellectually kind of genius and psychologically kind of interesting, very interesting. But what it means is that oligarchs who were trying to take over power from a budding democracy in the former Soviet republics, including Russia and Belarus, for example, and Ukraine, recognized that they had to find some way to convince people to vote them into power. The whole point of a democracy is you don't let it get taken over, right? So how do you do that? How do you get people to vote against what they really like? And they actually came up with a formula for that. There were a bunch of theorists on this, and they actually came up with a plan. And that plan had 5 steps in it. And you've seen most of them in the United States, including flooding the zone. Just making sure there's so much out there that nobody knows what's real any longer. And they either lose heart in the system altogether, or they start to believe lies, which is what you're seeing with this Republican emphasis on virtual reality, on something that is not true, on something that is a constructed world that you can get people to react to, so they ignore the real world and they vote to put people in power as strongmen and to take power over the country. So one of the ways to do that is to investigate individuals, to just flood the zone with shit, as Steve Bannon said. Also to run fake candidates, something else we've seen. And there are a number of ways that you create this fake world. And the degree to which the Republican Party has embraced this concept of a fake world is really horrifying, I think. It's really, and I don't mean horrifying as in terror-inducing, because I think many people now see through it, and I can talk more about that. But what poverty of spirit to have replaced democracy with, I can fool you into putting me in power. And that, when I say horrifying, I'm reacting, I think, to the humanity of it, and the idea that you would piss away our democracy for Rudy Giuliani. I mean, that is, it just feels so disrespectful and ignorant of the many wonderful things that this democracy has done. Never to say it has ever been perfect. That's not the point. But I look at this moment and I am sad, not that we're holding Trump to account finally, but sad that a major American political party has fallen to this. And in that, by the way, I am joined by the true conservatives in this country, people like Judge Michael Luttig, who is a conservative, was a Republican, now he is a staunch conservative, who embraces conservative values and says this isn't conservatism, this is a radical attempt to overturn our government. So that I wanted to really emphasize this idea of how do you know what's real? You wait and you see if people are willing to say it under oath. And I think what you're going to find is the people who are defending Trump, I've never seen one who was willing to speak under oath. The people who are saying this group of Republicans has perverted our system, many of those people, most of those people who are testifying are themselves Republicans who don't stand for this and don't want any part of this. And watch who is willing to speak under oath. And for people like me, I mean, nobody's going to offer me an oath. So like, what are my sources? Do you believe my sources? You can look at them. I give them to you. And I say, if they're not right, tell me, so that we can get to a place where we are both operating with the same level of facts. So I wanted to start with that, in part because that's the big story right now for somebody like me, is these two political parties, one of which has started to embrace this, has fully embraced this idea of virtual politics, that we're no longer going to engage with the world. Now we're simply going to engage with convincing people to keep us in power so we can do what we want. And that's, it's a little horrifying to see us mirroring places like Russia, but it's also just such a change from our history that somebody like me is like, whoa, this is the really big story. But then there's also the piece of it, how do you know going forward who's telling the truth? When Trump comes out and says, I've got a report here that exonerates me, should you believe it or not? And why? Well, why isn't he saying it in front of a judge under oath? And the reason for that is because it's a lie, and he's just trying to convince people of things that aren't true. All right, so people have asked a couple of other questions that I think I have time to get into. So first of all, people have asked about this Georgia indictment. Why 19 people at once when the special counsel Jack Smith's indictment focused really tightly on Trump and a couple of other participants? Why is there this difference? And I am not a lawyer, okay? I read people like Joyce White Vance and Ellie Honig and all those people, but this is what I understand about that. But if you are a lawyer, you should tell people. So what I understand is that if you indict a whole bunch of people at once and give them this much time to to show up, to turn themselves in, they have until the 25th of August, there's a really good chance a lot of these people will flip. So some of those people, the businessman who organized the fake electors in Georgia, is he really willing to go to prison for 5 years minimum for Donald Trump? I sure wouldn't be. So I think the beginning of that hope is that that a lot of people will flip and give them more information to catch the really big fish, is the reason that they would do that. You asked also, why isn't Lindsey Graham in that initial indictment? I want to point out that there are 30 unindicted co-conspirators in this document, and we don't know who they are. And it may be that he is one of them. It may be that there are more indictments coming. It may also be that he has told what he knows, that he flipped. And I don't know the answer to that, but there's going to be a lot. He also came out this morning and said, oh, well, this is, he had nasty things to say about it as well, which he may be doing something simply to cover his own, what. So there's a lot of pieces still in play going forward with all of these indictments, and similarly in the indictment, the federal indictment, there may be more people coming forward there as well. So there's an awful lot of pieces that are still moving, and it's not clear at all where they're going to end up. People asked me, is there really going to be a trial before the election? And I don't know the answer to that. There's a lot of, obviously Trump tries desperately to delay. That being said, it does seem to me likely that at least one of them is going to go to trial. And by that I mean one of the two recent ones. Remember, there is another trial going forward on October 2nd in New York against Trump. And that has to do with Trump's businesses and whether or not Trump and his oldest 3 children are going to be able to continue to do business in New York. And that really matters because that's Trump's basis of finance. So there's all these pieces moving all the time. And how's it going to come out? I don't have a clue, but I will tell you, I would rather not be on Donald Trump's team right at this moment. That being said, one of the things that's interesting about the Georgia indictment is that Georgia will televise. It's not clear that the other indictments, the other trials will be televised, but Georgia's will be televised. And the reason that matters is this: to go back to that idea of Trump simply trying to convince people of things that are not true by flooding the zone, by lying, by attacking, he's saying just horrible things about people that are completely unfounded in anything. I mean, he came out with something the other day about Fani Willis that I'm not going to repeat, because it was vile and it was not vaguely true. But lots of people on the radical right ran with it. So one of the things that's important about the moment going forward is that it certainly looks as if Trump has given up trying to win legally, that he sort of recognizes he's in real trouble. So instead he's trying to play this out politically. And this, again, is my wheelhouse. This is something that I'm really interested in. His political power has always come from the fact that he presents himself as a strongman, as a dominant figure. And this is what he's doing. Rather than dealing with the legal side of things where he's, wrong-footed, he's trying to go out aggressively and attack. That's always been his thing. That is Roger Stone's mantra, always attack. Trump's mentor, Roy Cohn, always attack. Well, what happens for people who like that dominant figure when they see him sitting in a court of law with people saying horrible things about him and him not being able to attack, him just sitting there and having to take it? What happens, and he's very aware that this is going to be the case, because anybody who's into dominance language will tell you this, he will hemorrhage support. Because think of like a fifth grade bully. They retain their power by bullying other people and always looking dominant. But the minute that somebody comes and puts them in their place, everybody else jump ship as quickly as they possibly can. So Trump is really appearing anyway to try and play this as a political game. Again, getting out in front of cameras, getting out and being dominant, trying to whip people up into violence. And it certainly seems as if he is trying to whip up violence against those who are holding him to account. But this, I think, is really interesting because, and I know people are really frightened about this, but do you see it happening? I mean, not enough people showed up. We came really close on January 6th. But at the end of the day, Trump did not have the support of the military, and that really mattered. The military stopped. It came out after June 1st of 2020 when he did the whole, walk across Lafayette Square, Park there, and the flashbangs and walk to holding the Bible to the church and all that. The military across the board came out and said, we support the Constitution, not an individual, which is the point at which Trump, if you remember, tried to create his own military out of the law enforcement officers to which he had access in the executive branch. But he doesn't have that anymore. Like on January 6th, there were a lot of pieces in place where now it certainly looks as if he was expecting to be able to invoke the Insurrection Act. And personally, I've always wondered if that wasn't part of the plan to get Pence in physical trouble, possibly Nancy Pelosi. If you think about the fact that all those crucially important people who were legally to succeed Trump if something were to happen to him, to get them into harm's way, and then simply to invoke the Insurrection Act, how would that have played out? I mean, I kind of, that keeps me up at night. But even on January 6th, it didn't happen. And now, after more than 1,000 people have been charged for their behavior that day, and many of them have gone to prison, he promised that he would help people financially pay for their lawyers. He didn't do that. I mean, it's been now 2.5 years. How many people really are willing to keep supporting him in a visceral way? And I think this is one of the things that we've been testing now since the first indictment in New York, where everybody was, I remember my friend Victor Shai happened to be in New York that day, and he's like, there's no one here. He's got his camera. He's like, look, no one showed up. And then he's like, wait, I see someone. And he goes running over to him and he goes, oh, look, they're two housewives from the suburbs and they're here to celebrate. It was clear nobody was showing up in New York, but there was a real question about whether or not people would show up after what was happening in Georgia. And I don't think it really has. And I don't think it is going to. So the degree to which he's really going to be able to whip people up and get them to incite violence or to be violent, there are certainly plenty of people on social media right now calling, as they say, for civil war. And somebody responded today and said, you show us how it's done. If you're going to try and whip up your supporters to do this, why don't you get out there first? Because they're not stupid. And so he's taking this political run. And that is interesting in two ways. Let me tell you the more common way in which it is interesting. And that is that what is the Republican Party going to do now? The Republican Party is in seriously bad shape in the sense that now they can only rely on the idea of this fake reality and hope that people are convinced by this fake reality. And as people slide away from that, what they've been leaning toward instead is simply suppressing the vote and controlling the mechanics of democracy. And that's a problem. I mean, right now they're talking about impeaching Janet Protasewicz in Wisconsin, who is the person who's been elected by a huge amount to sit on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And now there are gerrymandering cases coming up, and it looks like she's going to say, no, we need fair maps. At which point, the Republicans in Wisconsin are in really big trouble because they've been succeeding there only because they don't have fair maps. So on the one hand, they're trying to simply maneuver the system. On the other hand, it's really clear, I think, to younger Republicans, and by that I mean newer to the game, not necessarily younger in terms of age, that this is not a winning long-term play. And if they would like to have political careers, they need to do things like have policies that are acceptable to a majority of Americans. And right now, the Republican Party simply doesn't have that. So going forward into 2024, what are they going to do? For the vast majority of their, I shouldn't say vast majority, for their base, the people that they can count to show up to vote for Trump, they will vote for Trump and probably no one else. And without that base, they cannot, they just don't have a party, really. There just aren't enough numbers there. So on the one hand, they're tied to this man who is now the only U.S. president who's ever been indicted at all, and he's got more indictments than anybody can count. At the same time, in the general population, Trump has never won a general election. Remember that. He's lost the vote in 2016 and 2020. Do you think he's going to get more people now, especially now that we know that a great number of Trump voters have died since 2020? And many more young people are coming up and voting. So for the Republican Party right now, it's a real question as to what they should do and how they should go ahead and jump. So that is one way in which this moment is really interesting in terms of American politics. The longer term view that interests me is, of course, what Trump tried to do on January 6th was not unlike secession, was not unlike what the Confederates tried to do in 1861. And it's not an accident, of course, that guy carried the Confederate flag into the White House. I'm sorry, into the U.S. Capitol, which I have to say was one of the lowest points of my life, considering where I spend what is my reality. But there's a reason that happened. And now this is really important, I think. And one of the very first things I ever wrote before I started doing the Letters from an American or anything was a post on my Facebook page about what is a shock event. And one of the ways that the Confederacy worked and that the leaders of the Confederacy managed to get ordinary white Southerners to support a war that was designed essentially to take all the economic opportunity away from poor white guys who figured out early on that power was really concentrating among the wealthy Southern oligarchs. The way they did it is they did it really quickly. They did it, Lincoln is elected in November of 1860, and the South Carolina legislature is still in session. They're the only legislature at the time that was appointing its electors by itself. Everybody else had votes. The South Carolina legislature didn't. They said, we're going to secede. So it happened really quickly, and they were out. Of course, Lincoln isn't going to be seated until March of the next year. But they and a number of Southern states went through, the leaders of Southern states went through the Christmas holidays where people are out in parties and they're drinking and there's lots of money because you've just had the harvest and they're talking a big game and the whole thing, and they run with that and they get secession really quickly. And they do it by, there's a lot of the states don't have secession votes and all kinds of things, but they make it happen really quickly. And one of the reasons that the North and the United States under Lincoln is able to push back and is able to eventually triumph in the Civil War is that they had time. And one of the things about the passage of time is that when people get time to think things through, they rarely do rash things. I mean, somebody always does. But one of the things that certainly the politicians trying to stop secession were trying to do in the secession winter was to slow things down. Because they said, if we wait till planting season and, we get some cooler heads prevailing, this isn't going to happen because people don't really want to go die. And one of the reasons we get the firing on Fort Sumter in April of 1861 is because it's planting season. And the Confederates know that if they don't do something then, it's all going to kind of fall apart and they're all going to look like weenies. So instead, they really forced the country into war really quickly. And that, of course, would have been a course of action that would absolutely have catered to the insurrectionists and Donald Trump. If he could have done it fast, the faster he could have done stuff, the more he could have accomplished. Now, and that's of course exactly what Steve Bannon tried to do, and Stephen Miller as soon as Trump went into office, was to force through a bunch of stuff quickly that created chaos, and then take more and more power. We forget how quickly all that happened, but the travel ban, for example, was in place less than 2 weeks after Trump took office. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on really fast. and people were, everything was chaotic and people were worried. Now we've been at this since, if you only want to go back to January 6th, 2.5 years. And a lot of people have had a lot of time to say, hey, do I really want to risk everything for this guy who seems to do nothing but talk about himself, and I can't quite figure out what's in it for me? There's still a personal identity in associating yourself with Trump and saying, well, he did nothing wrong and all those sorts of things. But are they willing to fight for him? And I mean, historically, I would just kind of say no. So is a sort of larger matter, looking at where the Republican Party is right now and where Trump is now, the fact that it's taken so damn long has really made it feel like there's not going to be this sudden rush to defend Trump in the face of these indictments. What you're seeing is a lot of people in power trying to say supportive things so they can hope to get Trump's voting base. But did you see Lindsey Graham out there carrying a gun? I mean, I don't. So anyway, that is the larger picture that I just find interesting. Okay, so a couple other questions that people asked about, and so I see that somebody has asked yet again about Hunter Biden. Just let me quickly give you my understanding of where Hunter Biden is right now. Hunter Biden has an addiction issue. He is currently not suffering from the hard period of addiction. He is in recovery. He had a really bad time about the time his brother was dying. When he was in that time, he didn't pay his taxes, which is pretty common, and he carried a gun, and he said in an affidavit that he was not a drug user. He was. So that he lied on that. That is what is currently on the table for the crimes that he has committed. He has repaid his taxes, including the penalties, and that was as soon as he got into recovery. That's not a reflection of the troubles that he has had more recently. There may be other things, but that is all that is on the table right now, and where there was a plea deal. And by the way, in both of those cases, neither one of those cases usually involves the kind of penalties that he has gotten, leading lawyers to say that he's getting a worse deal because of who his father is, not a better deal, which again feeds into this whole idea of virtual politics. You've got to make the man look like a criminal. And I also think that they are deliberately trying to force his addiction back into an active phase, because that would indeed hurt his father. And I just think that's evil beyond belief, personally. Hunter Biden is not a member of the government. He never has been. Apparently has no interest in that. And he is a private citizen. And one of the things that Democrats say is that, why are you focusing on Hunter Biden, who has never been part of the government, and not on the Trump children who were in the government and who got hundreds of millions worth of emoluments and deals while they were in the government. And then, of course, as soon as they were out of the government, Ivanka Trump's husband, Jared Kushner, got a $2 billion investment from the Saudis into his financial fund, even though he had no experience doing that. And the people in charge of that money said they didn't think they should invest with him. And the leader of Saudi Arabia, MBS, the Crown Prince, personally overruled that. So you're really going to take a look at Hunter Biden's taxes and the fact he's repaid them, and not at the Trump children. And this is why you keep hearing about the Biden crime family. There is no Biden family business at all. This is an attempt to make it look as if they're doing the same thing as the Trump organization, and they simply are not. I mean, which again is very frustrating for someone like me. I don't really have time to tell it, but I'm tempted, very tempted, and maybe I'll write about it at some point. Something very similar happened to Grant, and as a historian, it just makes me bonkers that people have ideas about Grant and what Grant's presidency was like, because he was the victim of a smear campaign, and that again, that came down to whether or not somebody was willing to repeat those charges under oath in a court of law, and was not. And anyway, I won't go on about that, but it does interest me. All right, so a couple more questions. You've asked about the 14th Amendment, and I keep getting all these things about the two conservative lawyers who have done a deep dive into the 14th Amendment and said this really should mean that Trump can't hold office. And I'm going to be profane here, which I know I usually don't do on these things, but this is I'm a Reconstruction scholar, so I'm like, I'm sorry, but no shit, Sherlock. That's exactly what this was designed for. But that and, $10, I'll get you a milkshake at McDonald's, right? Or however much one is. They were supposed to be 29 cents this weekend, but the machine was broken, just saying. Anyway, how do you implement that? I mean, one of the problems that we have going forward right now is that the Republican Party itself is party now to Donald Trump. They have bought in. And in a normal era in which there are people in office who are protecting our democracy, Trump never would have made it past his first impeachment. I mean, which was, remember, we have Ted Cruz saying at that point, not a single one of us believes what you are telling us, to Trump. And Mitch McConnell saying this is about the next election. Don't, whatever. We know he's guilty, but this is about winning in 2020. And that would never have happened, even under Nixon. I mean, Nixon resigned because Republicans said to him, we will not support you because we believe you have broken the law. And his law, remember, was a cover-up. The only thing they had him for was the cover-up. They didn't have him for the crime, although the cover-up made it look like he had been part of the crime. So what do you do? How would you make that happen when the Republican Party leadership would have been out in front of every possible argument screaming, this is partisan, you're trying to destroy a political party? And so it makes it much more difficult to actually use the 14th Amendment in the way that it was designed to be used. And people have tried that at the state level, sometimes with success and sometimes not. But it would be a very hard sell right now. So why is it important that these two conservative lawyers have said that, in fact, it should apply to Donald Trump? Because you are starting to see cracks in the Republican Party where old line conservatives who were gritting their teeth and thinking that the world was going to come back to normal after Trump went away, which, by the way, I always thought was a dream, are starting to say, no, this is not okay. And the more people that do that, the greater the chances that some of them, not all of them, the true Trumpers are gone, but that people who will take an off-ramp and say, we'll take a loss in 2024 and we'll regroup for 2028 with a clean new Republican Party. Is it going to happen? I have no idea. But in terms of that understanding by those conservative lawyers, it was great. But it's lots of people have been saying 14th, why not the 14th? To which the answer keeps coming down to, okay, so what if it goes to the Supreme Court? Do you think the Supreme Court is going to uphold the idea that the 14th Amendment overrules Donald Trump and his ability to hold office, and all the Republicans who, I don't know, put them in office, especially when we know that people like Alito and Clarence Thomas and others feel that they owe their allegiance to that political party. That is a political question now, really, I think, rather than a legal question. All right. That also brings up another question that you asked me about, and that is, and by the way, people argue with me about the whether or not that's the case, whether or not the 14th can be used. Believe me, I think that's what it was designed to do. I mean, and I'm kind of an expert on it. But there's a difference between that being what it was designed to do. By the way, it was designed to do a lot of things we no longer let it do, and it becoming a political reality in this moment when we have this albatross, if you will, hung around the nation's neck. Which, by the way, I'm going to tell you where that comes from. Anyway, one of the questions that people have asked is, where the heck is Mitch McConnell in all this? And the answer to that is Mitch McConnell seems anyway to be ill. He's an old man, and all that is not necessarily here or there for what I'm about to say, and that it seems very clear that Mitch McConnell has lost control of the Republican conference. And it's called the Republican Conference. I do not know why, and I should of all people. It's the Democratic Caucus, the Republican Conference. That's the people who legislate, and he is clearly not in charge. The fact that Tommy Tuberville, I'm sorry, but it's spelled Tuberville. The fact that Tommy Tuberville has put a hold on our military so that we have more than 300 senior positions empty either says that Mitch McConnell is complicit in that weakening of our military and potentially leaving those seats open for a Trump presidency, or that he simply has no control over Tuberville. And my guess is the latter. And that's not necessarily because he's old and ill. It may be simply because the Republican Party has at this point gone so far toward Trump, either because they are complicit in his actions. I have my real curiosity about a number of Congress critters, because they believe in the white nationalist and cause. They are so thoroughly white nationalist and Christian nationalists that they don't care that he is such a weak vessel, because they're afraid of his supporters or of him, or simply because that's the path of least resistance is not clear. But it is clear that there's a significant chunk of the Republican Party that cannot separate itself at this point from Donald Trump. So the fact that Mitch McConnell is missing in action, as it were, is I'm less concerned about Mitch McConnell as a human being than about what it says about the political party. All right, a couple more questions here. I think that's mostly it, actually. That's most of the questions you asked. So I'm going to tell you. There's more stuff, by the way, but I, like I say, I'm tired, and I got to write tonight, and my daughter's here. But albatross around the neck, because what the heck, let's have fun. And I gotta say, it's killing me. I'm not sure what I'm going to do tomorrow. I think I know what I'm going to write tonight. So much happens in August. There's so much cool history that I'd rather write about than any of this crap. That I'm really tempted to give you all a letter on the Yukon Gold Rush, which is the anniversary of which is tomorrow. And it's a cool story. But the reason we talk about an albatross being around someone's neck is because an albatross is a bird, and it is an ocean-going bird. They're beautiful. They're big and they're beautiful. They can travel hundreds of miles across the ocean. But they're symbols of good luck for sailors. And in Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is an epic poem that is about an ancient mariner, right, a sailor, he shoots an albatross, and which is a symbol of good luck, and he shoots it, and after he shoots the albatross, which falls to the deck, everything goes to hell in a handbasket. There's no wind, and they get stuck in the doldrums. And you know that old saying, water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink? That's from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And in order to make him do penance for the fact that he's brought this bad luck on the ship, they tie the dead albatross around his neck. They hang the albatross around his neck. So that's supposed to punish him, and also to signal to God that they should bring luck back on the ship. So when we talk about hanging an albatross around someone's neck, it's an old reference to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner and to the symbol of good luck for mariners. So anyway, I hope that that's enough. I'm a little short time-wise, but I'm tired. We're all tired. And once again, let me just emphasize two things here. One, for gosh sakes, take breaks. If somebody said to me apologetically the other day, they hadn't been able to read me for a while because he still gets my stuff, but he finds it overwhelming. And I was like, excellent. Go for a run, garden, knit. Time to knit Christmas stockings, by the way. I'm busily doing that. Just do something to give your brain a break, because that is also reclaiming your life and enjoying it and having friends and spending time with your family. All of those are ways of reinforcing the kind of society that we want to have. So if you're out in your garden growing flowers, that's not ignoring the world, that's contributing to the world. So really enjoy that. And second of all, I guess I should just pick up what I left with on the idea that the insurrectionists didn't move as quickly as they needed to make their world exist. And that is that increasingly people are aware of what's going on. And I'm still very concerned. I'm concerned about the degree to which the mechanics of our democracy have been sewn up. I'm concerned about the number of people who seem wedded to this false reality. And I don't just mean the people who are pilloried in the press as being Trump supporters. I mean journalists who are lazy, or who are just repeating right-wing talking points without identifying them as right-wing talking points, accepting them as part of our public discourse, like saying the way Biden has handled Hunter Biden's legal troubles when he hasn't gone anywhere near them. That worries me a lot, because for people like you and me who are hyper turned onto this stuff, it's easy to say, oh, well, that didn't happen. But we're not like most people who are going about their jobs and who are not paying attention on a day-by-day basis to what's happening in the news. And they might say, "Oh, well, I know Hunter Biden is corrupt, and I've heard that Joe Biden took bribes, and they're both the same. And I'm a Republican. I'm going to vote for Republican." That worries me a lot. But that being said, I look around me every day at how many people are involved in their democracy and talking about the word democracy and caring about the direction that not only this country but the world is going. And it just doesn't feel the same as it did in 2015 to me. It really doesn't. And then people say, well, what's going to happen when they take over? And I think, tell me what that looks like. How do you take people like us and say, now we're putting you back in a bottle, and we're going to tell you how everything is going to happen from now on? Do we say, oh, okay, I don't see that happening. I don't see how you do it. It's not to say you can't do it, but I don't see how you take a moment that feels like it is so full of possibility and desperate need to address things like climate change and refugeeism and war and economic inequality and racial inequality and gender inequality and all the things that are bubbling up, begging for responses, and say, no, we're going to go back to 1981 and pretend none of this is happening. I just don't see how that happens. So I think at the end of the day, it really feels to me like the tide has turned. So if you're starting to feel overwhelmed, as I say, get outside, do whatever it takes. But I don't think any longer it's time to despair. At least I don't think so. All right. Thank you for being here. And I will see you in some form of letter tonight. Thank you for being here.